Question. Who kidnapped you? Answer. I was kidnapped by a guy in his 30s who I knew. Even though I'm a teenager, I make money by being a freelance musician, so I worked, and still work with older people a lot, as when someone is hiring a cheap orchestra, they often consist of retired folks, not teens. This particular guy I had known for about 6 months prior to him kidnapping me, as we were both in the same section of a community orchestra. An 18-year-old friend of mine who had been in the orchestra longer than I warned me that he was weird, and in the months leading up to my kidnapping, he had done weird things that were red flags of a creep, but not necessarily a person who would kidnap a girl. Because I live in the middle of nowhere and towns are few and far between, I have to travel a distance to gigs and rehearsals. One night at the community orchestra rehearsal we were practicing different pieces that didn't require everyone. My 18-year-old friend and a few other people from my high school were amongst the ones that got to leave early. They all live nearby in the town where the rehearsal was taking place, whereas I live a town away. My parents are older and have a habit of falling asleep early on the couch, nighttime rehearsal, and sometimes forget to come get me. My 18-year-old friend told me if they didn't come to call him, and he would bring me home. Anyway, rehearsal ended and I was standing outside of the building waiting for my ride. By the time everyone had cleared out I decided that my parents weren't coming. Rather than making my friend drive back to the building to collect me to then turn around to go dozens of miles to my house, I texted him and told him the situation, and explained that I would walk the half-mile to his house. He said that was fine, but to be careful as the roads are lined with trees, and it could be hard to see pedestrians. I told him I knew and would see him shortly. I walked out into the dark parking lot and passed by 2 cars, one of each I knew belonged to the janitors. In a far and dark corner of the parking lot that I would have to pass by to walk out the driveway I saw a 3rd car, but I didn't think anything of it. I assumed that maybe a new night janitor was being trained, or maybe they had hired a night security guard or something. This rehearsal was at a local elementary school, but again small town, so no security cameras. When I walked by it, a masked man who was way taller than me jumped out behind me and put me in a chokehold. I'm pretty well versed in self-defense, but when carrying a heavy gig bag, an instrument case and a music stand, there's not much that can be done on a whim. He forced a piece of tape over my mouth and shoved me into the trunk, where he struck my head and I passed out. As for motive, he admitted it to me within days of taking me. He was weirdly obsessed with me and saw us as having a relationship. He's very clearly a disturbed individual, as my friend had previously warned. Question. Sounds like a terrible experience. How did you escape or get rescued? Answer. Like I mentioned earlier, I live in the middle of nowhere, and my abductor took me about an hour north to even more in the middle of nowhere. It was winter time, and he was keeping me in a cabin in the middle of a state forest. The windows were boarded up and there was a layer of dust over everything, much like it was an abandoned storage place. I built up his trust, and when he would come by every day to visit me, he had a wife who divorced him once I escaped. I managed to eventually convince him to let me go on walks with him outside of the cabin. When we started doing this I realized that the tiny cabin was part of a cluster of many and I knew them. See, although they were tucked into the woods over a mile away from the roads and now stood abandoned, they were functional during the summer as a camp. This was a camp I had attended for many years, but he didn't know that, and I didn't mention this. Over time I managed to convince him to let me move into a larger cabin, specifically the largest one of the camp. It was the only one that was large enough to have dividing walls with 2 sleeping areas and a common area. All the others were just a few bunks. I had stayed there my last summer at the camp, and knew about a faulty piece of paneling that kids, including myself, had used to sneak out to go and watch the fireworks on the lake on the 4th of July. Once he let me move in there I waited a few days until I felt the time was right and I was safer. He visited me, and I waited for him to leave. He, as always, locked the door and windows. I waited half an hour and then snuck out through the paneling. The fact that after all these years they had never replaced it is the only evidence of divine intervention I've ever seen. He assumed this place was safe because even if I did escape, how could I find my way out of thousands of acres of woods? I knew the way out because of my previous summers there. I didn't actually completely run to the end of the woods, but rather to a forest ranger station that we had always been taught to head to in case of emergency. I sprinted in shouting and scared the hell out of the 3 people inside. They were obviously confused, so I just kind of pointed at the missing posters wall, where the freshest one had a picture of me from a few months prior. Their eyes just kind of collectively widened as they realized what was going on. Police were swiftly contacted, and I gave them my story and the identify of my abductor, who was arrested the next morning. I've never been so grateful to see people in my life. Question. So your parents were supposed to pick you up, but didn't? What did they say about your disappearance? How soon did they report you missing, etc.? Answer. So my parents were supposed to pick me up, but often didn't, so it wasn't uncommon for me to get a ride home with the aforementioned 18-year-old friend. Something I forgot to mention earlier was that I also texted my parents that I was going to get a ride home from him, as I later learned from my mom that they were asleep. According to my friend, when I didn't show up at his house for an hour and didn't respond to texts, he hopped in his car and drove up and down the half-mile stretch between his house and the place where rehearsal had been. When he didn't see me walking, he went home and his mom, who's a teacher, and he got back in the car and drove the abandoned stretch of road slowly with the windows open, and kept calling my number. When they made it to the parking lot, they heard my phone ringing. It had been thrown to the ground by my abductor, who had also removed my smartwatch and put it on top of my phone. They were the ones who reported me missing. However, the police thought that I might have simply run away, as my relationship with my parents wasn't the greatest. But my parents and friends knew that wasn't the case, so even though there was no Amber Alert, they made sure my face was everywhere. My friend's mom taught at our school and personally went around and gave missing posters to every kid and every teacher. The community united. I later learned that even some police officers didn't believe that I had run away, but there was no evidence. My parents were obviously devastated when they woke up to the police knocking on their door at 2 a.m., so I'm eternally grateful for my friend and his mom stepping up to lead the way and help my parents out. Question. Was there any punishment for the kidnapper? Have you struggled with any mental issues after? I imagine it must have been horrible. Answer. Yes, he was arrested and pleaded guilty to a ton of charges, and will be spending the rest of his life behind bars. Although he was mentally ill, there was evidence he pre-planned it, so he couldn't plead insanity. He's serving time and getting the help he needs. As for mental problems, the memories of my friends and loved ones and my music kept me sane. However, I've definitely made many lifestyle changes and have a much greater love for pack mentality, and I don't think any of my friends or I will ever walk anywhere alone again. Question. Do you have any fear or paranoia now that most people wouldn't already have? Like, are you constantly on the lookout for danger, always aware of your surroundings more than other people? Are you distrustful of people you don't know or don't know well? Will you ever attempt to walk home from anywhere again? Answer. Yeah, I'm definitely more paranoid now. I was jumpy before, but now it takes a lot for me to trust anyone. Even walking in the hallway at school, I'm hyper aware of other people. As for walking places, well, my best friend lives about a mile down the road from me, and I used to bike there all the time. It's a ride that can be completed in less than 10 minutes, and unlike the place I was taken from, it's a main road. I biked there once in the middle of the day, and her parents flipped their lids at me, saying that they'll give me a ride from here until I have my license. I'll walk places, and I do sometimes, but always in broad daylight, on main roads and in groups of 4 or more. Question. During your time with this sicko, how did you feel about him and the overall situation? Obviously you weren't beaming with joy that some creep just kidnapped you and kept you in the middle of the woods, but did you feel angry? Bitter? Rage? Scared? A strong mix of emotions? Did he have weapons in the cabin? What was the food like in the cabin? How was it going back into society after 3 months of isolation in a cabin with your kidnapper? After you escaped, how did your parents, friends, school, etc. react to you coming back alive? What did you learn from this experience? Were there times where you tested the dude's emotions? Like annoyed him to see when he'll snap or something? Answer. I was mostly scared and angry, but with time I channeled that into a scheme for me to escape, because I realized that I had to take control or no one else will. He did not have weapons, thankfully, although I did try to fight him a couple of times early on, but it didn't go well. The food was cheap crap from grocery stores like cereal, some grains and other bagged things like beef jerky. I'll never take advantage of having options for food again. Going back into society was honestly a dream come true, as one of the ways I motivated myself to keep going was through thinking about all of the amazing times I had had with friends and family in the past, and how I wanted to get back to them. Being able to socialize was fantastic, even if people did walk on eggshells around me for a while. My parents were obviously elated to have me back. I later learned from my dad that my mom had essentially lost all motivation to go on while I was gone. My friends were thrilled as well. One of my friends had actually been the person who reported me missing. When I returned to school, people had known that I was coming back, but not when. So the day I returned, I got out of the car with my best friend, the friend who had reported me missing, and one other really close friend. For the most part, people were actually really good about it. It got very quiet when I walked into the school, but then someone walked up to me and said something along the lines of "Welcome back," and it just got better from there. The semester had changed while I was gone, so going around and introducing myself to my new teachers was very awkward, but they were all very good about, and also very good with helping me make up work. The two teachers that I had been slated to have for the whole year welcomed me back with open arms, and were happy to have me back. I'd say my main takeaway from this, other than to be aware of your surroundings and take precautions to keep yourself safe, was to really value every moment you have with everyone you love, because you could lose it all in an instant. And no, I never tested him. I had known him previously and knew he was off, but something had clearly snapped inside him,